In this episode of a musician's podcast, I had the pleasure to interview Edouard Brenneisen. He's an incredible composer who made music for Riot Games' League of Legends, Blizzard's Overwatch, and Warner Brothers' Multiversus, and of course, many more. And it's just incredible how he makes these tracks. They are so unique, and the ideas behind them are just incredible. And you really know that this guy knows exactly what he's doing. And if anyone knows how to make video game music, then it's definitely him. So I'm super excited to present this episode to you. It's going to be 4 parts. In the first 2 parts, we are going to talk about Edward more. And in the third and fourth part, it's more about the music. So I hope you enjoy the episode and write down in the comments if you learned something and what you learned from this episode. Have fun.
Yeah, it's I've the majority of the time for composers, it's either going to be Cubase or it's going to be Logic from Apple. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's one of those two.
But did you start out on another DAW or was it always Cubase?
Actually, my very first DAW was, and I mean years and years ago, was Cubase. And after that, I was on Digital Performer for many, many years, which I loved. But at some point, because of some of the I guess the coding issues with the software, I needed to handle a lot more tracks than I could with Digital Performer, so I made the switch to Cubase.
All right. And how did you get interested in making music in the first place? Like what is your background story, if you can say it like that?
So I was friends with kids who had older brothers when I was in middle school, and around 10, they started listening to bands such as Queen and U2, and I was mesmerized. The very first album I bought with my own pocket money was U2 Achtung Baby, which to this day is still one of my favorite albums of all time, and just got fascinated by all this stuff. And at some, I just picked up a tennis racket and was playing air guitar. And after badgering my mom for long enough time, we got me a guitar and got me started on stuff. And basically, that was the the start of all of this this entire journey. Being really into a variety of music, but yeah, it started with a guitar for me. And specifically, yeah, listening to a lot of U2, Pink Floyd, and Queen early on, as I was growing up as a musician. And I had my phases and discovered a lot of things. And this happened through a relatively short period of time in hindsight now. But between 10 and I'd say 16, I went from this like pop rock thing to maybe metal and then fusion and then fell head over heels for jazz, which then became my main thing for a long time. And I was just this, I still am hopefully this very curious person, but got into jazz and jazz improvisation, and that was like kind of the launch pad for the more serious part of my life as a musician. And through jazz and improvisation, there were a lot of other languages that started kind of tacking themselves onto that. And my understanding of the world through the work of listening to different players, their voice, their vocabulary, the influences they were bringing up, the stuff they were talking about, and the intersection of that kind of universal solvent, which is jazz music in a way that you can really analyze and dig into a lot of things, and all these influences that led me to other places and um, started. listening to classical music as well. And started getting interested in like film scores and video game scores and all of that around that time
As
as
a
well.
as a teen, or when you got older, 20, or yeah.
As a teenager, yeah,
So you had
in late teens.
a lot of phases you went through as a teenager, from heavy metal, rock, pop, classical music, everything.
Everything, and it's I think people talk about their talents or their gift was, and I don't have a gift for music per se. Everything I have to my name in music was just the result, and it still is to this day. It's not an easy thing for me to do. Um, but if there's one gift in hindsight, I think I had this like kind of unbound curiosity for so many different things. And I still do, without prejudice, without forethought. You know, if I hear something and I like it, then it doesn't matter what style the name that it bears or the style that it should be in or anything like that. It just becomes part of what I like to surround myself with.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, I guess into the mind of a teenager, you know, which is a completely crazy speed. Well, then you get across a few years just so many things that you can latch onto and discover. And it's, you know, I wish I'd done more classical music very early on, but at the same time, there's nothing that I grew up listening to or getting influenced by around that time that I'm not actively using these days as a professional composer.
Okay, so interesting. So in your scores, everything that you listen to coming into your scores when you create something.
Yeah, I mean, if you even if you take the pop aspect of things, if you're listening to um, Queen or Pink Floyd, this idea of extended forms in pop music, things that went beyond the traditional song form, um, that's pretty much exactly how you build a suite of themes for a project, right?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of storytelling that goes into that. And there's also a lot of very strong melodic sensitivity um, in your approach to crafting the music. And those two things, they just work really the same way. It's very, very interesting. Um, and especially in the game world where themes are so prevalent still to this day, fortunately. Um, this ability to kind of take music that's approachable from a thematic perspective and craft longer storytelling passages that kind of take you through a journey and really help you identify with a locale or a character. Um, that's that's entirely what my world is about, really.
Yeah. So it's incredible how the projects that you have listed in your bio, all the things that you have worked on or are actively working on, it's amazing. Like how did you get to the point where you make music for epic games, for Overwatch, Harry Potter? It's crazy to imagine that someone can achieve this level of, like, for me it would be success if you get there, but how did you get there?
So let's backtrack quite a bit before that, because I was a
Yes.
musician and I studied primarily jazz improvisation, and most of my schooling was around that, with some composition lessons thrown in, which were super helpful. But it wasn't like the core of my um, experience as a student. And
Yeah,
then
so you
I
didn't
ended up
study music, you studied something
I
else.
studied music, but I studied, you know, jazz improvisation. I went to school for that. I was a
Oh,
guitar player, um, and more so than anything else. around that time, I also, one of the interests that I had was for music technology. And when I was a student back in Paris, I used to produce songwriters and like kind of listen to their songs and like arrange them and stuff, and would basically do all that work. And that I became really familiar with music production around that time, which would end up being incredibly useful in the future for me. And that was really a natural part of my way of creating music, if you will. Um, After studying in France a while, I ended up going to Berklee College of Music, and I was also at that time really interested in composition and screen composition, but I still opted into becoming a performance major, and I went on to studying with a bunch of great, great teachers there. And I was a jazz musician, and I graduated as a jazz musician, and then ended up doing the jazz thing, which was to move to New York City and played in clubs. But I still had, this kind of music technology thing going on where I was able to conceptualize music from a creative perspective in terms of just the very fabric of music, but also realize it with my own means, either through recording with others or being able to program stuff for more electronic jazz music things or arrange long form music. And one of my friends who had gone to Berkeley for film scoring started rescoring trailers, like replacing the
Yeah.
soundtrack with their own music. And I thought, oh, you know what, this is super fun. Let me do that. And then I did a few just for my own enjoyment and like, well, how can I take the music production thing further? And I did that. And somehow I saw a in the Berkeley network thing, a little announcer film, and I sent in my work, and much to my surprise, I got the gig. And the director was like, "Oh, I got about 70 responses, and well, there you go. You made the cut." And that should have alerted me to something, which is that this is an incredibly competitive
Field.
industry.
Yeah.
But it so happened that I got the project, and then that very nice short film with like pretty good production value led to other projects, which led to other projects. And my girlfriend at the time, was now my wife, and we got kind of tired of New York City, and we decided to check out the American West Coast, and ended up shortly thereafter moving to Los Angeles, which led to more work primarily in film and TV.
Yeah.
Um, And then, I started doing some game work as well, really indie things, which were super fun. And then I ran into this this job posting for an in-house composer at Riot Games, and I submitted my application, and somehow, again, much to my surprise, after not too long, got the got the um, got the job. And
Incredible.
and then they told me, well, we had 892 applicants, and you got the gig. And I was like, okay. Um, it was not a gig.
Not a gig
It was in a
anymore.
house. Uh, but then, I stayed at Riot for a few years, and I was lead composer on League of Legends, and that was really cool because you had this combination of a huge platform, and until you work on such projects, you don't really know what it's like to have an audience of 100 million players.
Yeah.
Um, and music for this character called Kindred, which is a lamb and a wolf, kind of two sides of um, death, if you will. And I
Yeah.
wrote this very romantic piano and cello duet, um, which to me felt completely natural in terms of the musical expression, but until then kind of had not been part of the regular vernacular of game music. And I remember when people heard that, um, people were flipping tables. Some of them for good reasons, saying, "Wow, this we've never heard this before. It's amazing." And some of them because it had like kind of crunchy harmonies and was stylistically my version of what romantic music should be. So, kind of for untrained ears, a little bit out there. Um, People were calling me a hack and making all sorts of comparisons to that and atonal music, which Kindred was not a piece of atonal music. Anyhow, yeah, that was an interesting introduction to the power of just this super massive games and the kind of audience that those games are finding and how interested and really dedicated players are to the sound of their games.
Wow,
In a
yeah.
way that, unless you're talking about really top soundtracks on very, very big tentpole movies, sometimes television, there isn't really that type of really hardcore following for music in the silver screen world, I'd say. But then, after a few years, I went back to being a freelancer, like being my own person and seek out different adventures. And I guess with that resume I had built over the years, reaching out to me, or I was reaching out to them and building connections. And that's how I ended up working on all these other things. Just um, combination of relationships, opportunity, your name being out there, somebody listening to your work by accident. I still get people like saying like, "Oh, we really like this theme that you wrote. We'd like to commission you something that's in that style," and so on and so forth.
Incredible. I really like how you described the Kindred theme, how you made it. So, how did you go about that when you first made it? You see a new character, probably, I guess, before Kindred was introduced to the game. You see the character, you know, okay, this is part of death, essentially, as far as I know. And how did you get to the point that you thought like, okay, lovely romantic music fits this character? What was your thought process behind it? Or if you scored other themes for characters, what did you think that then resulted in the theme that you wrote for the character?
The way I approach character themes, of which I do a lot, still to this day, is usually try to write from the perspective of the character. And that makes things a lot simpler for a number of reasons. Um, Kind of removing myself from that equation as an observer of that character
Mhm.
and letting the players or people who are watching the show or playing the game kind of make up their own mind about who that character is about, and kind of removing the judgment from, yeah, observing who that character is. And so my baseline generally is to write from the perspective of the character and to kind of give them as much of that truth as possible. Um, then whether you see them as threatening or whether you see them as um, lovely or anything like that. That should be your judgment as a viewer, but it shouldn't
Mhm.
be in the music, so to speak.
Oh,
Um,
okay. That's interesting, the
it,
perspective, because I
yeah,
think like I talked with Forrest last week, and he said when it comes to making film music, he gave me the thought of we are not making music for the film we are making the film because we contribute the music to it. So that's a very it's like the opposite to your approach to remove yourself completely instead of maybe adding something to the character that you think is a good way to paint this character, something to add with music.
That's specifically with character themes, I'd say. It's just really embracing the perspective. And actually, you know what? It's not because I'm making that decision. It's still me taking a stance when it comes to the role that music is going to play in there. So it's not entirely different from what you've been describing.
Mhm,
It's similar enough, but me coloring, say you have a funny character, me making the music funny, it's not really helping the character shine through, right? That
mhm,
character is funny because of who they are, not because of how I see them. Um, so making the music from their perspective, maybe, you have this super extravagant character who's like really um, has interesting mannerisms, wears very colorful clothing, and you make that all of that part of the music, and then it becomes this thing that's like, wow, it's weird and it's so like that character, but it's funny because it's just this character is they're their own person, and we're seeing them, and that's it. And that's the funny part there. It's the rub of when that comes into the world and what that looks like. Um, but yeah, my generally with character themes, my goal is to really embody them from their own perspective, how they see themselves. Um, now, when you're dealing with drama, it's a different ball game, and sometimes you need to be kind of putting a very specific bend on the music and inform things in the music that are go beyond what the film is telling you and have that subtext that drives the narrative along. But for character themes, it's a little different, in my opinion.
mhm.
Um, so the process for Kindred was not dissimilar to any other process that I've had for other character themes on the and all the games that I worked on. Um, which basically you get a brief, and sometimes there's music references, sometimes there's no music references. In the case of Kindred, there were no music references. Just this idea of duality, which I try not to be too smart about things. And when you're brought up this idea of duality for two characters that do work together, the lamb and the wolf, in this case, I thought a duet was the best way to embody that symbiosis, that working together. So that's what I went with.
All right. And for uh, which other characters did you also make the themes of in League of Legends?
Oh wow. Ilawi, Tarek, Jin, Zion Rakan, Nico, Kane, Warwick, Kled.
Wow.
I'm sure I'm forgetting one or two. Um, yeah.
But that's plenty. That's incredible. How does your work process? You get the idea, the concept of the character, and then you immediately began writing, or was it like you got the concept, you got the art of how this character is supposed to look, what he's gonna do, what he's good at, like a little backstory, and then you went into thinking, okay, how can I make this? And then you got to writing, and or how was the work process in that case?
So for me, uh, I'd say 100% of the time, unless I'm in a very, very dire deadline situation, I like to get the information, a little bit of um, actor method type thing where I'm like, okay, how does this character talk? How do they move around? What's their general um, view on life? And kind of get to feel what it feels like to be that character.
Like a method
Um,
actor.
because yeah, and I think that's actually pretty helpful because then music is something that's pretty physical. You do either play it yourself, you other musicians play it. It's sure it's just airwaves at the end of the day. But there's something about making music that is physical. Even when you're assembling stuff in a DAW, you spend hours behind a computer
Yeah.
figuring things out and looking for somebody's way of being that informs, how they talk, their size, how nimble they are, and and I always find that to be really interesting. And then I try and get information as possible up front. Get the people who are working on the project to tell me in their own words, um, how that character feel, how they think. And I find that that's when I get information that isn't on paper. Uh, Getting their understanding of the characters is super useful. And as a composer, I generally intervene on a very narrow slice of the project,
Mhm.
um, music, and the writers, the producers, these are people who've been involved with the project a lot longer and a lot more deeply than I have been. So hearing from their perspective how things work is incredibly useful. So then once I have this knowledge of who characters are, or what a situation is, or what a locale is, um, I let that simmer at the back of my mind.
Mhm.
And I've grown to just not think about it and let my creative mind then come up with that naturally. A little bit like a dialogue. I have this person was the kind of the project manager, and the project manager is like gathering all this information. This is
Mhm.
who that person is. This is what they do. This is when they do it. This is where they do it. Okay. And then I push all that information to the creative inside, and that creative will be ingesting that information and letting the engines of creation do whatever thing that they do. And then at some point, I'll start getting ideas. And sometimes they're very abstract concepts. Um, and sometimes they're fully formed pieces of music and anywhere in between. Um, and that's how it works for me.
Yeah.
Kind of really present the part of me that's complete and then letting the part of me that's really creative, fully right brain, not really any kind of interference there, and just feeding information. Um,
Yeah.
After having done that for a number of years now, um, that process can be generally it's fairly quick. It's not like I get a brief and then I have to wait 24 weeks for things to kind of germinate in my mind. It can be a matter of minutes to sometimes days, but it happens. And it's just a matter of getting the right type of impression and information and letting that flourish on its own.
Okay, so a lot of really space that you're giving yourself to come up with something and get the creativity going. So, how much time do you get for a character theme?
It really depends. I know I'm going to be doing a demo for a character theme this weekend, and I know I have, I don't know, a day to work on it.
Hmm.
So that's going to be very, very fast. And I know that before I do that, I have to go back to the brief and kind of get that information for me, and send it, then come back and like hopefully there's something that comes out of that exchange. And then sometimes, depending on the projects, it can be several weeks, sometimes can be months.
Hmm.
When you're a busy professional, you're not just waiting for things to come up. I mean, I'm working on several projects at the same time. And creativity, going back to what we were talking about, it's not really something that's mysterious in the sense that it does its own thing. It's also something that's cultivated across now the better part of the nearly 30 years plus that I've been making music. It's a mindset, it's a muscle, it's something that I do every day. So I have a process, I have the experience, I know where to get the creativity. It's something I've worked out. Um, it's mysterious to others who don't do that on the daily. But I think for people who are creative every day, it's just a relationship you have the same way you have a relationship with your body. You're like, I'm thirsty, I'm gonna drink. My relationship with my creative mind is I need to create. Okay, let's create. And yeah,
When you do a lot of projects, uh, how do you keep track of when you have to do what?
I live with a variety of reminders, either in digital form or in paper form, all sorts of organizers, spreadsheets. I use this thing called QDB, which allows me to log in information for all the projects that I do with very detailed annotations and allows me to kind of get around to working on bigger projects, really helpful. Um, so that's the one of the things I do. Um, and yeah, just have to be very very precise with everything that's around you and get a sense for when you can reasonably accomplish things. And it's a bit of a dance, but it's also useful. Having multiple projects at once, it allows you to when you stall on any given thing, you just move on to the next task, and then you let your creative mind solve the problem literally in your sleep sometimes, and come back to it the next day, and maybe you have the answers to that question, um, which is something I really have come to enjoy. It's harder to kind of there's a lot of moving parts on a big project by itself. So if you start adding multiple big projects, that's a lot of moving parts. But then being able to ping pong between different creative avenues, like, it's refreshing. It stimulates the mind. I like it.
Yeah, amazing. If you work on different projects right now, is it uh, what games is it that you're working on? I get because I think you're primarily in the game industry, not in film industry, right?
I'm primarily well, the project that just finished actually is a film. Which I can't quite discuss. But yeah, these days most of my work is I'd say it comes from video games. Unfortunately, none of the projects I'm working I can talk about. I'm working on I can talk about. Um,
That's all right.
there's an element of secrecy around everything, and yeah, it's just the lay of the land. Until it's out, can't talk about it.
That's all right. Then how about we talk a little about the things that you recently did? What
I worked on for a few years on Multiversus by Warner Brothers, which is kind of a Smash Brothers like game in the greater Warner Brothers universe with a bunch of characters like Scooby-Doo or Arya from Game of Thrones or all these things. And a combination of many things really rooted in orchestral music. Some of the I've ever had to write actually was kind of crazy, but also really neat expressions of that in other genres like chiptune or kind of hip hop or all sorts of things.
Mm.
So that was for Warner Brothers. I worked on a shooter that unfortunately just got canceled by the studio, a shooter called Dead Drop. And they were developing this vertical extraction shooter, which was super cool, set in kind of parallel universes were still the prevalent aesthetic. So I got to do music that a blend of cyberpunk and 80s rock, and it was really cool because these are the sounds I grew up with, and you never know when you're going to need those textures, right? But um, I grew up watching Miami Vice, actually reruns of Miami Vice, and hearing that those Jan Hammer synths, and when I'm being asked like, "Oh, can you write this thing?" I have very vivid memories of those sounds, so it's super useful. I also did some music for the game from NCSoft, um, called Throne and Liberty, and that was released on PlayStation 5 recently. That was a game that was initially just published in Korea. I had a huge following there, and yeah, ended up doing some music for that. And yeah, these are some of the more recent things I've been doing that I can talk about.
Amazing. That's so cool to see what you can actually work on and how different these things actually can be. And yeah, I'm not really into 80s music or anything because I mean I grew up in an entirely different generation, but to really have that knowledge and know how can I make something that's has the same aesthetic, I think that's really amazing. I mean, I assume you really studied it. Like you no, you studied jazz, and I mean, I think that was more popular in the 80s, right?
Might have been. It's not a very popular style nowadays, but I'd say the biggest takeaway for me style of music was how it allows me to internalize the sound of any style of music at this point. Um, and basically very quickly understanding the implication of melody, rhythm, arrangement, harmony, in a way that when I was doing it as an improvising musician, had the instant, you're laying on something where you have a rough framework most of the time of what you're going to be doing, but there's a lot of part of it that involves immediate, very intentional manipulation of music. And that happens only if you're able to understand it. And that kind of approach to music and how it's done and developed, that's something that, um, yeah, I guess I can attribute that to developing those instincts with improvised music.
Yeah. How was another way that you really got to understand music? Are you someone who's reading a lot of sheet music or really studying the theory of music, how sounds correlate with each other and something like that? Is that something that you really
Absolutely. Whenever I have time, one of my favorite things to do is study music. Um, there's just an infinity of avenues in there, and a beauty that can be found in becoming really, really knowledgeable about music and any kind of path you can hop on. You can go as far as you possibly want, as deep as you possibly want, and you will never find the end of it, whether far or high or low. Like it is infinite. And there's immense joy in that. And I remember reading the words of the boss of UDO, this AI company that does music, who said like, "Oh, I don't think people want to study music. It's too hard. They'd rather use AI tools and stuff." I mean, I taught music to a lot of people. I am surrounded by very creative individuals. And my own experience and my friends' experience and my collaborators' experience tell me that knowledge, art, and the fun that there is in there, and that element of discovery of that subject and self-discovery,
Yeah.
that's an integral part of the human experience, in my opinion. Um, Going back to your question, yes, I have, and I still do when I have the time, dedicate time to study music, the theory of it, learning from scores, which when I transitioned from being an improvising musician to something else, I composed a lot of time reading scores. I love the information that's in there. Um, and I think that's one of the best as a developing musician at any stage in your craft, in your practice, is
Mhm.
kind of opening up those books, putting on the headphones, listening to the music, or being at the piano and doing score reductions and all things of that nature. Um, there's just an infinity of knowledge out there, an infinity of information that you can capture, and
Yeah.
nuance and beauty there. Um, and I don't know. I think there's a the part I love working. I love making things myself, and but there's also a world in which I wish I had more time to study and be a. I could see myself spending 12 hours a day studying music instead of writing it myself. But that's not the way the economy goes, unfortunately. I'm not a scholar. I'm a composer for hire. But yeah, just study is part of the curiosity, and study is really part of how I guess you define yourself as a creative, and how you just learn new things for yourself, make you a better craftsperson, make you then hopefully more valuable to the people who are susceptible to hiring you.
Yeah. You said an an important thing would be to play with score reduction. What exactly is that?
So a score reduction is the process large format score, the traditional conductor score, and then taking part of that score or all of that score and condensing that information in generally 2 to 4 staves, something that is a synthesis of what's on the page. And that's how I learned to write a lot. Was like, okay, that's how I learned to write choir. I got all of the score and like put everything into a piano staff, look at the different ranges, the overlap of voices, and s- kind of that process of how are you able to take a big set of information, kind of boiling it down to its essential core function that then allows you to hear that. If I have the right to keep going with that example, I know that once I have this core function, this core ID, you bring it up into a bigger format, into a real choir writing by going with this process. And that's infinitely useful.